The purpose of this slideshow is to introduce some key concepts in semiotics, or semiology, depending on who you read, the science or study of signs. And the reason that we're looking at this is because we often think of objects as signs, particularly objects that are worn or used in some way to construct identity, a way of communicating. You'll also recall from our reading of Henry Glassy the first week of class that we have sometimes referred or think of objects like texts. So the idea that material objects are part of the way in which we communicate, and using theories of linguistics, from which semiotics comes, to think about objects is not a new idea. So thinking about objects as signs is a way of thinking about how we communicate through our appropriation of, use of, or wearing of different material objects that signify in specific ways. So I want to introduce some of the basic concepts of semiotics so that when you encounter them in the reading, you'll have some idea of what the heck they mean, especially if this is a new idea for you. Semiotics comes out of the theories of two particular 19th century thinkers, Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist who laid the foundation for much of modern linguistics, and Charles Saunders Peirce, an American philosopher and logician who's sometimes referred to as the father of pragmatism. Both these men developed theories of signs, although these theories are not related, but both of them do inform our practice of semiotic analysis. Let's start with Saussure, who probably had the biggest impact through his theories of language. Saussure saw language as a system of signs. Signs for Saussure were composed of two components. The first, a signifier, the form which the sign takes, and the signified, which is the concept that the signifier represents. The relationship between these two is referred to as signification, the way in which the sign, the signifier, and the signified work together to make meaning. Now, important for Saussure, signs are arbitrary. In other words, there's no necessary relationship between the signifier and the signified. It can vary from language to language, culture to culture, but in the context of the language system, its meaning is naturalized. So, for example, Saussure uses the word arbre, tree, in French. So when we say tree, the signifier, we understand that it means tree. But not a real tree, not an actual tree, the concept of a tree, the idea of a tree, or the idea of a tree in that particular culture. So the concept and the word sound signifier constitute the sign. Now, signs on their own don't really do much. They're always located in a system, which is, for Saussure, is language. We also see later in semiotics the use of the idea of code. We see this in Umberto Eco and Roland Barthes. Again, the code is the system, so the code is like language in this respect. Now, signs are defined by their differences from each other in a network that is the signifying system or language. And so again, we go back to the idea that signs don't have any intrinsic value except for their relative position. Saussure also understood signs in terms of oppositions, so things like black-white, night-day. These signs only make sense in terms of their relative position in opposition to one another. For Eco or Barthes, the system of signs is the code. And codes are culturally specific, just as languages are. So the role of semiotic analysis is to decode the meaning, to figure out what the code is in any given system. Language is also social. It's a way of articulating experience and therefore is necessarily bound up in ideology, inscribed in signifying practices, discourses, texts, myths, presentations, representations of the way things are. And because language is social and lives in the real world, it can change. So we do see changes within these systems now, quite independent of Saussure. Another thinker, Peirce, was developing his own theories of signs. And we can distinguish between Peirce and de Saussure as Webb Keen does in his Signs Are Not the Garb of Meaning. We can see that Peirce was actually less interested in language as a conceptual system and more interested in how language worked in the world. Peirce developed an idea of signs that distinguished between icons, indexes, and symbols. And this becomes important in semiotics because we want to understand how the sign is actually operating in relationship to the real world in a pragmatic way, right? Through speech acts or through acts of communication. So let's look at these three. Icons are straightforward representation. Icons usually have a physical resemblance to the thing being signified. A good example would be any kind of street sign you see, a deer crossing or under construction, or a trail marker. A lot of these have icons on them. And of course, we're very accustomed to thinking about icons now in the digital world as well, because we're sitting here and looking at a desktop screen full of them. The idea is that the icon has some sort of physical resemblance to what it is representing. Now, the index is a little bit more abstract. The index is not straightforwardly representational, but rather suggests, infers, or indicates some aspect of what is being represented. With an index, the signifier cannot exist without the presence of this signified, but it's always one step removed in a sense. So we point to it, we say, oh, that, and it suggests something larger. So for instance, the classic example that's used often is smoke is an index of fire, or here, skull is an index of death or mortality. The index, unlike the icon, does not resemble the object that's being signified, but it does imply it in some way. So you'll often see this in works where a sign is referred to as being indexical, which means that it's actually pointing to something in particular, but something larger. You see this in terms of like material objects or bodily features as being indexical of a persona, identity, or social position. Finally, we have symbols, which have no resemblance to what is being signified, and so the connection between them has to be culturally learned. Numbers are an example of this. Symbols come to represent something in a fairly essentialized way, but only because we've been socialized into that cultural world. So again, it's fundamentally arbitrary, but it doesn't seem arbitrary because we know what it means. We've learned what it means. Now, indexes or icons can become symbols over time if they are sufficiently repeated over and over again so that they become naturalized in this way. Another thing Peirce points out about signs is that they can be bundled. So we can think about doing things that only make sense in relation to one another, or relationships between signifiers. And signifiers can also have multiple signifieds. So if you think about the example from the Keene piece of red, right? Something red. Red can be a symbol or an index of any number of things. Fire, apple, blood, love, the heart, danger, passion, right? So we can talk about the fact that signifiers are not only arbitrary, but they can have multiple signifieds. A sign can mean more than one thing, but it also means in relation. And this is important because it opens up meaning beyond what Saussure was going for. Saussure really saw language and science as being in a system that was relatively fixed in a deep structural way. But within a post-structuralist thinking, and Peirce is not a post-structuralist, but he does kind of lean towards a post-structuralist sensibility because he's looking at language as in practice, right, pragmatically as speech. But in a post-structuralist way of thinking, we know that signifiers can have multiple signifieds. And we can think about signification not assuming a static system, and that's what allows for this multiplicity. Now, there's a couple different ways in which folks have thought about this. The basic move is we don't look at the language as a system, but we look at its practice in speech or in communication if we're thinking about signs more broadly beyond words. And a couple of folks have thought about this. One is Julia Kristeva, who is a feminist philosopher. And she wrote about signifying practice. This is the idea that Hebdige uses in his piece on punk, right? The production or reading of texts, participating in a system of signs, and kind of cutting through, traversing it, manipulating it, appropriating signs, and constructing new meanings. Another version of this we find in the works of Henry Louis Gates and signifying. Now, signifying is a vernacular verbal strategy from African American culture of indirection that exploits the gap between the denotative and figurative or connotative meanings of words, subsuming other rhetorical tropes like metaphor, metonymy, irony, and hyperbole. And we can see signifying in a range of African American vernacular arts, such as throwing shade, playing the dozens, boasting, loud talking, rapping, or reading, all examples of signifying. Gates points out that signifying has its origins in the practice of divination among the Fon and the Yoruba people, and in the folk tales of the signifying monkey and his deception of the elephant. So signifying is also linked to the figure of the trickster, right? It is fundamentally about play. Signifying draws on formal language and its conventions, but it also does it with what Gates calls a signal difference. And his dropping of the G at the end of signifying is a kind of way in which he gestures towards that signal difference. Now, in the African American tradition, signifying can really has this sense of being playful. Jazz musician Mez Mesro said signifying is to hint, to put on an act, to make a gesture. Zora Neale Hurston referred to signifying as a contest in hyperbole carried on for no other reason. So we can see this as being very much about a kind of manipulation of language or manipulation of signs through signifying. Gates takes the idea of signifying as a vernacular strategy and expands it to consider signifying as a literary strategy in a double voicing, repetition and reversal that he says exemplifies the Black discourse in general. What this means is that at the level of the sign, in signifying, the sign is always doubled back upon itself. Meaning is always multiplied. It doesn't straightforwardly denote, but rather connotes in some other way. And this is important when we think about personal cultural expression in terms of race. If we think about something like clothing and the way in which clothing, particularly formal clothing, or aspects of clothing as a sign, might signify differently on a Black versus white body, that signal difference. And this is something that comes up in your reading for this week about the and in the case study of the zoot suit. And we can see the zoot suit as an example of sartorial signifying. It's also interesting because if we look at this more broadly in terms of Saussure's ideal of language, we can understand that race itself is a sign or a trope, arbitrary but naturalized, and rooted in this unstable opposition between Black and white. And if we can think about the way in which signifying as a cultural or expressive strategy destabilizes opposition, then we can see it as fundamentally deconstructive. So I think this is one of the things that's really cool about Gates, and also why Gates becomes so influential in the late 80s and early 90s, not just in literary criticism, but in cultural criticism more broadly. Because he's using this vernacular conception of Black language to create a literary reading strategy that deconstructs texts. So in a sense, in both of these cases, whether we're talking about signifying practice or signifying, we're thinking about objects as signs, linguistic signs, arbitrary, naturalized, but also manipulatable, right? In practice, they can then have multiple meanings or be manipulated in deconstructive ways to open up meaning. And this is what we mean then when we refer to something as being polysemic. Polysemy, the idea that any text generated has potentially infinite range of meanings, and that multiple meanings can be signified by a single object or sign. So a sign is said to be polysemic if it has this infinite range of meanings, and sometimes it can have these multiple meanings simultaneously. In a sense, meaning is up for grabs. It's a deconstructive way of looking at signs, and in many signals, in many ways, what's been referred to as the triumph of the signifier over the signified, which is the idea that, you're going from Saussure, the sign is the signifier, and the signified, and together they constitute the sign. But if we think about the fact that a signifier can have multiple signifieds, then of course the signifier becomes the dominant component and the important thing that we focus on. And we want to map those multiple significations. A good example of polysemy, or a polysemic sign, can be found in the punk aesthetic outlined by Hebdige. So let's take, for instance, the very ordinary object of the safety pin. Now, the safety pin, as a signifier, signifies safety, repair. It's used to fasten on diapers on babies so that they don't get poked. We use it to repair clothing, or maybe to fix the front of our shirts so that our bra doesn't show, right? Any number of things that we use safety pins for are safe. Safety pins fix. They make things okay. They construct safety. But in the context of something like punk, the association with safety is ruptured. The naturalized meaning of the sign is broken. So now, instead of being an index of safety or repair, the safety pin becomes an index of rupture, of destruction, and perhaps potentially pain, physical, mental, or spiritual, in terms of the nihilism of the punk aesthetic. If we take this idea of signifying practice to look at the context of punk, then we're looking at the appropriation of signs and the reconfiguration of them within new systems of meaning. So one of the things that you see in punk is that there's a tendency to utilize an aesthetic of rupture, taking things that are sacred or transgressive and then making them a prominent part of the aesthetic. So here we have Vivienne Westwood and Johnny Rotten with Destroy t-shirts that Westwood created early on in the punk movement in Britain. We have the upside-down crucifix and also a swastika. Now, what's interesting about the use of the swastika here is that Westwood and early punks were definitely not Nazis. In fact, many of them organized against racism. So what gets accomplished then when they use a symbol of Nazism, reconfigured in new signifying practice? How does this then become polysemic? Now, we can talk about in our discussion on whether the swastika is one of these essentialized signifiers at this point that's so overdetermined that it cannot be appropriated to a new signified. But at the very least, we can recognize its use by punks was a form of semiotic nihilism, right? This idea that this doesn't mean what you think it means, it really just means nothing. And we can also see in the left-hand image a woman wearing a garbage bag as a dress. So the idea that, something that signifies garbage or refuse, or maybe containment of something disgusting is now being put on the body and comes to signify in very different ways. But because it also carries its former meaning, it's a dress, but it's also a garbage bag, right? It still has that prior association. So the only way that the garbage bag and the swastika work as nihilistic or transgressive symbols in this regard is that they still retain that vestige of the prior signified. So the idea is in signifying practices, you can traverse the system of signs, but you can't fundamentally overturn it. You're using it, you're manipulating it, but you're still within it. Signifying practices are reconfiguring what is signified by the signifier, and the signifier comes to be the most important part of the sign. But in the multiplication of signifieds, we don't necessarily, we have these multiple meanings. So it's, again, meaning is up for grabs. Now, this deconstructive semiotic practice becomes particularly central for understanding the way in which signs and objects as signs circulate within late capitalism. If we think about the semiotic landscape of capitalism, we know that it is defined primarily by commoditization, or even the permanent commodification of things, being the kind of rendering of everything as potentially a commodity. And we can look at things like branding logos, brand names, and all of these signs in the capitalist marketplace that are essentially indexical of commodities and also have some larger connotative meaning, like Coke. So we get a sense that within capitalism, we're surrounded by all of these signifiers, many of which are ultimately detached from their original signified. They become free-floating. And this happens because commoditization strips objects of their essence and their cultural specificity, their singularity in that equivalence that we talked about. And this is what enables their cultural appropriation and their manipulation. Now, when we're surrounded by these free-floating signifiers, signs become free in this way. We can see, that triumph of the signifier. Signs are all around us, but not necessarily with an original referent. So this is what Baudrillard calls a simulacrum, something that replaces reality with its representation. So we see this a lot in the cultural landscape of postmodernity. The simulacrum is not a copy of the real, but becomes a truth in its own right, constituting a hyper-reality, which is a reality unto itself. The classic example that's given by Baudrillard is Disney World. Nothing in Disney World is signifying any relationship to the real, but is a reality in of itself. Cinderella's castle, Mickey Mouse are essentially free-floating signifiers. Although we have an original reference point in terms of the character Mickey Mouse, there's no fixed signified for Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse is representing this larger hyper-reality of Disney. So that in a nutshell are some of the key concepts of semiotics, different ideas of the sign, the signifier, and the signified, the idea of the index, icon, and symbol, and then also to think about the way in which signifiers and signifies operate in relation to one another and how they can be subject to multiplication, rupture, and other forms of deconstructive manipulation through signifying practice, resulting in a polysemic landscape. So what we can do this week is think about then, how do we apply these semiotic ideas, semiotic thinking to material objects? And what are the possibilities and the insights we can gain by doing that? And also then what are some of the limitations of what is essentially a linguistic and visual approach to objects?